book. Democracy Hacked, How Technology is Destabilizing Global Politics. I wish I could say there was a table where you could get copies, but seek them out at your nearest bookstore. I think there's an online place that sells books. I can't remember the name of it. Martin is the director of the Center for the Study of Media, Communication, and Power, and a senior lecturer at King's College in London. Is that right? Did I get that right? And a researcher at the Policy Institute. So I want to jump into the themes that you dealt with in the book. In particular, I'm interested in the similarities that you described between a whole bunch of different, seemingly unrelated movements. So Narendra Modi in India in 2014, Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines, Brexit, Emmanuel Macron, Jeremy Corbyn, even the Five-Star Movement in Italy. What is it that these things have in common? What is it that makes them similar?
Thank you. Thank you for starting with such a small question. And thank you for coming here. I should say that I genuinely have never been in such august surroundings as this. Yes, thank you for
Hard to concentrate.
Hard to concentrate. I suppose, I should explain a little bit where this started in a way. I mean,
sure.
why I got to where I got. I think I was thinking about this after we spoke earlier, and I think for me, the thread really began in about sort of early 2017, February, March 2017. And I was digging through the expenses for the referendum because in our country, there's very strict spending limits. Everyone has to hand in invoices after the election, but they don't get published until about 6 months after the election or referendum. And they'd only just been published at the end of February. I was digging through these invoices, and I kept coming across, from the Vote Leave campaign, I kept coming across these references to a company that I'd never heard of called Aggregate IQ. And the thing is, I study this stuff. I mean, I look at political consultancies, I look at elections and referendums, I'm trying to understand how they work. And so I thought, that's interesting, I wonder who they are. And it wasn't a small amount. It was, well, at that point, it was 40% of their budget. It turns out it was more than that. But I could find almost nothing out about them. I mean, I kept digging around, and I tried calling them, and it went to voicemail. Right. I have a cousin who lives in Vancouver Island, and I tried to convince him to go down to Victoria to knock on the door. But the more I kind of dug around, the more I realized that actually not knowing about this organization, not knowing who they are, what they did, when almost half the budget of the Vote Leave campaign went on them, was pretty significant. And so then I started saying, well, digging more around not just the referendum, but the UK election, and then looking more broadly and saying, okay, so how is this, is this just unique to the UK? And started seeing that actually some of the themes that I'd found in the UK around the referendum campaign were similar in elections around Europe. I was looking at France in 2017. I was looking at what had happened in Spain and Italy since 2012-14. And then I started looking more broadly and realized that actually, it goes much, much further than that. I mean, Rodrigo Duterte's election in the Philippines in 2016. You look at obviously what happened in Brazil recently with Jair Bolsonaro. And
even the AfD in Germany.
The AfD in Germany, the Sweden Democrats. And suddenly, what became clear to me, or at least over the course of kind of the research and doing the book, was that we've seen this enormous transformation of the communication system. We've seen politics go online. We've seen campaigns go online. And so, in a way, it seems peculiar to think that politics will remain the same when it goes online. And in fact, what I found more and more was that actually politics, in the same way as our communication system has been transformed, politics is being transformed. But the difference is that many of the kind of norms and principles and rules and laws that we have in IRL, in the real world, in real life, either don't apply online or can be easily bypassed. So what became increasingly clear, and certainly when I was studying some of the people who were trying to game elections and hack elections, was that we have what seems like a kind of a Hobbesian situation online, where it really is seen as and acted as a conflict. It's almost like information warfare. In some cases, it is like information warfare in the case of certain states. But the way in which people act, the way people attack one another, the way people brigade, harass, lynch, mob, feels an awful lot more like a warfare than it does like politics.
And it feels as though, I mean, your mention of Aggregate IQ, which of course was associated with Cambridge Analytica, and then Cambridge Analytica was associated with Facebook and data and privacy. I mean, it feels as though all these things are sort of connected on a level that we don't really understand while it's happening, and we're only starting to understand after the fact, and where a lot of it is sort of subterranean in a sense that it's occurring around you and you see bits and pieces of it, but it's hard to see how those things fit together. How do you track those things? How can we, whether as journalists or just people in general, how can you see those things happening while they're happening instead of waiting, for someone like you to write a book about it? And thank you for that.
It's really hard. It's really hard. So I approached this book. I mean, I have a confession. I mean, genuine confession. I do not understand contemporary media and politics. I mean, in this sense.
Well, welcome to the club.
Right. I research, I write, I teach this stuff. I genuinely don't understand huge amounts of it. And in a way, I mean, there's one of the reasons for writing the book was.
You're supposed to say you're the expert.
Well, no,
you're not supposed to say you don't understand it.
It was to help me understand. I mean, that was kind of the purpose. So that's why I structured it the way I did. I said, who's hacking politics? I mean, people keep saying politics is broken, and I agree. But who's doing it? Who's pioneering this break? And then how's it happening? And then what does it mean? How do we? How does it play out?
Right.
And one of the things, like a really good example, is the way in which most election systems. I mean, in our country and many European countries, most election systems they try and protect the elections by very strict spending rules.
Right.
And how much you can spend in either a local level or a national level.
Not in all countries, but.
I was going to say, there's a few exceptions, yes. But what became clear is that when you have a situation where data acts as a virtual currency, and where what I saw with people like Robert Mercer was how they would use data like patronage. So in the same way as in the past, if you had very, very deep pockets, you'd go and you'd offer a candidate an awful lot of money. Now you can go into a candidate and say, I have an incredible database. I have the software to enable you to target people with enormous accuracy, and not only that, but to learn about those people and then to evolve your communication on the basis, etc. And that is a whole new aspect of politics we haven't thought about, and certainly it's not in any way reflected in the law. I mean, there's at the moment, officially, you are supposed to record all your expenses, but the ability to bypass that in terms of data, whether you spend it, very early on, whether you license software at a very cheap rate, whether you, etc. There's easy ways to get around some of those rules. So we're not, as a system, I mean, way beyond journalism, as a system, we're not yet capable. I mean, funnily enough, actually, journalism. I think is one of, I hope, was one of our routes out of this. I was just, this morning, the Guardian has a great exclusive by Jim Waterson, who has managed to trace that in the last 6+ months in Britain, there has been almost £1 million spent on ads directed to people to say, Britain should leave the EU without a deal. There's no problem, we should do it. And these ads, I mean, you can imagine how much £1 million will buy you on Facebook. They're almost all Facebook ads. They're very targeted at specific constituencies where there's a discrepancy between the MP and the constituents. But when people tried to find out who they were being paid for by, they couldn't find out.
I mean, that's one of the problems, I think, is that so much of this, and it is changing because I think Facebook is feeling the pressure to change, and has its ad database and so on. But so much of this is kind of, dark funding, dark ads, in the sense that we just can't see what is happening. And so you know that there are ads, and you may know this much about sort of who placed them, but you don't know how they're connected to something else, which is connected to something else, which is funded by Robert Mercer or whoever. And those things, so much of it is, again, unseen and controlled by a single entity. So Facebook is having this massive impact on all of these elections, and people are using Facebook and its tools, whether it's the Russians or groups that we're not even aware of, and we see the impact of that, but we don't see the thing itself, and we don't see the machinery working. So how do we, obviously it's unfair to ask you to solve that problem this morning, but how do we do that?
Well, I think, part of it, so one of the great things about the report this morning was that Jim Watson seems to have traced the money back to Linton Crosby and Linton Crosby's company. Now, Linton Crosby has had a huge impact on British politics in the last 20 years, acting as official advisor to the Conservative Party. So if this is right, if money is being channeled through, then that raises enormous questions around the involvement of the party, of people within the party, Boris Johnson and others. I think, it seems to me there are two particular problems here. There's what I kind of call opacity by design and opacity by complexity. And by that I mean that up until really till very recently, something like Facebook was opaque by design, so it was incredibly difficult to find out anything. And in a way, we couldn't know who was sending what and how. Now that's changed a bit, so we now can see many of the ads in the ad archive, and I trawl through those ad archives.
But we're seeing like one layer of the ad.
Right, exactly. We're seeing one layer. So there's, but even if we could, they could be much more transparent and we could dig much further down, you still have the problem that if, as we discovered after the US election, if campaigns are sending out somewhere between 50 and 100,000 ads a day, as Brad Pascali said he was, and presumably that's moved on since then how on earth can we track that? And how on earth? That's the thing,
the scale of these. So yes, you can see an ad in Facebook's database. But yeah, if there's tens of thousands every day, and that's one entity, multiple governments, multiple parties, multiple agendas, it's almost impossible. The scale of Facebook and the information that it deals with is almost unimaginable, and that you can't wrap your head around it in real time. How do you even do that?
Well, in a way, so here's where I suppose we get a little philosophical. I think we are, we will be coming to terms with this shift from an age of information scarcity to an age of information obesity. And we will be coming to terms with that for decades, because I think it raises really huge questions about free speech, about some of our assumptions about the kind of Milton Mill ideas about truth bubbling up,
information marketplace,
information marketplace. Right. So I think that we will have to adjust many of our. But what I try and where I suppose I try and move in the last part of the book is we're in this weird position where, on the one hand, it feels, it is, in many cases, a fantastically chaotic world. I spend a while, we can talk about perhaps, I spend a while studying the 4chan, 8chan world. If you want savage and raw, go to 4chan, 8chan. But, so in one sense, it feels incredibly Hobbesian. In another sense, actually, you flip it around, and it is a world which can be controlled and centralized control more than any we've ever previously imagined. And the obvious example, obviously, being China. But it's not just China. There are many other countries looking at China, not necessarily to copy China entirely, but certainly some of the aspects of the model. Governments, love to centralize aspects of control, not least because it makes them feel like they can do more good. And it feels like they can help their citizens more in the way that this remarkable social experiment in India at the moment, which I think has been really reported, which is the Aadhaar experiment. The Aadhaar unique identifier where every, I think it's now 1.2 billion citizens have a 12-digit identification number, an iris scan and fingerprint scan. And that has become central to living as a citizen in India. I mean, you can't buy train tickets, children can't get school lunches without their Aadhaar number and their fingerprints.
It's like governments have read every dystopian, futuristic novel, except they see it as like a manual for what to do instead of...
Well, this is where I think it's really...
I mean, Black Mirror is supposed to be fiction. It's not supposed to be...
Well, certainly on that episode with the ratings. But this is where I think it's really difficult, because I think it's the frog in boiling water, isn't it? I mean, we are... There's a sense of inevitability to all this. And certainly one reads many of the accounts of Silicon Valley and the attitudes and how the kind of ideologies developed in the 90s and early 2000s. And actually, there is a kind of technological determinism to all this. There's a feeling that we have to go this direction. That,
And is that true, do you think?
Well, okay, so I think, there is one thing to say we have to recognize that technology allows us to do things. I'm thinking particularly about politics here, but it applies to many other areas. It allows us to do things which we really couldn't do before, and that the political systems needs to reflect that. I mean, when there's a huge discrepancy between what you can do using really basic and even free tools and what you can do via the political system, if there's too big a gap, people will just bypass the political system. And that's what we're seeing. That's what we're seeing around the world.
But it almost seems as though, particularly Silicon Valley and companies that come out of it, the assumption is because you can do something, you should do it. Because there's a potential good and lots of potential bad, you should do it anyway. And certainly Facebook, that seems to be its guiding principle, is, well, because we can harvest data on everyone at an incredibly granular level, we should do that. But it's not clear to me that anyone has sort of thought, well, really, should we do that? I mean, it just seems to be occurring whether we want it to or not.
You're right, it is. And actually, I was more, I suppose, hopeful about the aspects of that model a few years ago than I am now. And that's mainly my change of heart is because of the business model. Because I think that, so I don't, and apologies, if anyone in this room really properly understands digital advertising, please come and speak to me afterwards, because I spent months trying to understand well, not exactly, but generally how digital advertising works, and it is unbelievably complicated. But the amount that I managed to glean from conversations, from reports, from doing ad campaigns myself, was that this is an inherently corrupting system for journalism as well as for politics. That the system, as Shoshana Zuboff calls it, of surveillance capitalism, which essentially drives and fuels our news and information online right now, is poisonous.
Inherently poisonous, not accidentally poisonous.
Inherently poisonous. And if we don't fundamentally deal with that, then many of these things will get significantly worse.
And I mean, the problem is you're not just talking about a sort of side effect of this. I mean, surveillance-based business models are the foundation of these giant trillion-dollar entities. I mean, it's not as though you can just unwind them or uncreate them or,
No, you really can't. You really can't. And I mean, I don't underestimate the difficulty of doing this. I mean, what I worry is that actually in this current moment, and we are in a moment where, clearly the momentum has shifted and people are talking very seriously about regulation, which is inevitable. I mean, I think it always was inevitable, but I think people are talking very seriously about it now. My particular worry is that actually the regulatory responses will kind of consolidate and almost endorse the current system. Right. And that then it'd be even harder to change it.
So that feels like a real risk to me, in particular with Facebook, but even Google, to the extent that, and GDPR does this to some extent, those things effectively create moats around those companies that entrench their power instead of actually, mitigating it. So we could actually make things worse instead of better.
Well, certainly, I mean, absolutely we could. And certainly, again, at this moment, it seems to me as though there's a very dangerous possible link, and we've seen this happen, particularly in China, where governments seek to gain greater control of this online environment, and the best avenue for them to do that is via essentially collaborating and partnering with these very, very large companies. And at that point, when you start to get, as we've seen with Amazon facial recognition and law enforcement, when you start to get governments and authorities collaborating closely with these corporations who have built the most amazing surveillance systems that we've ever seen in the world, then you really do start to centralize power within governments in such a way that is very Orwellian.
And it's always a sort of red flag for me, and I know others as well, when companies like Facebook are asking for regulation. So when Mark Zuckerberg writes an op-ed saying, we think we should be regulated and here's how, that's like, I'm like, wait a second, why are you doing that? Is it because you suddenly had a light bulb moment and thought, wow, we're doing some stuff that's wrong? No, it's probably because you're trying to get out in front of this wave and help architect regulation that will help you instead of harming you. And so you wind up with this sort of interaction between the company and government where they're crafting the regulation. You've got regulatory capture, effectively.
You have regulatory capture, and actually...
I don't have a question, that was just a...
Well, I was just, as you were talking, I was thinking that news and information, and many of the people I think in this room will recognize this, has been a little bit like the canary in the mine, because lots of the effects of digitization have affected news and information first. And so people have seen these seismic shifts. I mean, as in other parts of the media and music and stuff. But I think where we haven't seen it yet, and where we're going to see it, is increasingly in public services, in education, in healthcare, in transportation, because that's where you really can change the way in which not just corporations but governments act on the basis of surveillance and data collection, and for want of a better word, behavioral control. Now, there are many. Again, we can come back to this thing. There are many incredible things you can do. I mean, DeepMind is able to identify eye disease far earlier than previous tests through its
so that's clearly a good thing.
Right. So it's accumulation of data around eyes and about what bringing in this huge amount of information to understand how eye disease develops has resulted in that. But so there are clearly good things, but then you think, well, hang on a minute, what's the next stage there? Because
what kind of architecture are you creating to do that could then be used for something else?
Right, and once you have the algorithm that tells you, this is how to figure out if eye disease is developing early, then is that a public algorithm? Is it a private algorithm? I mean, how do you charge for that? How do you restrict that? I mean, where you have systems of healthcare like we do in the UK and other places in Europe, it's a really difficult negotiation between the state and
I think that's a real issue with Facebook in particular. So much of what we're talking about is fundamentally based in the algorithm, which we know next to nothing about, and which Facebook and Google, to the same extent, has zero incentive to tell us anything about. And so how do regulators or even just interested parties, is it regulation? Do you compel transparency about the algorithm? And if so, how do you do that?
So here I'm going to step back a second, because I think that in a way, many of the conversations I have about this, completely understandably, you always get to the point where someone says, well, so right, what do we do? How do we regulate these guys?
Right.
And actually, as I say, I think regulation is inevitable. But it seems to me the first thing we have to do is to recognize the scale of the change we're going through. We have to acknowledge that this is not simply about one company like Facebook. It's not simply about. It is about a really fundamental shift, and that once we have recognized this is about a fundamental shift, then we need to start to say, well, okay, so given that, where do we want to be in 10, 15, 20 years' time? Do we want to live in states which have, which are dominated by 6 West Coast U.S. tech giants.
Sure we do.
Do we want to live in, I mean, the particular, I mean, I think there will be a lot of pressure, there already is a lot of pressure on national governments to consider whether they want to have, as Russia calls it, national data sovereignty. You know, do they want to hold all the data of their citizens within their own countries? Now, I think that's a very huge question. And
Something also China is pioneering.
well, quite. Which gives you an idea of the club you'll be in.
Right.
But so I think that there are these enormous questions which we're a bit distracted in the UK at the moment with other politics, but which are not being discussed, which are not being. I mean, there are people thinking about this, but there's very few, as far as I can see, big public discussions around where societies want to go, what they want, what they see as the end goal. I mean, when people say to me, when they say we should all own our own data, I think, what does that mean? What are the implications of that? Does that mean that we all start treating data as a currency? We all start paying for things with our own private lives. You know, my bathroom habits can buy me this, and my.
But it's even more, I mean, it's complex, as you said. What is my data? So is my digital address book, is that my data? It has you in it and all your information. That clearly doesn't belong to me.
Right.
It belongs to you.
Right.
But so if I own my own data, which part of that do I own? Do I own the access to it? Do I own the ability to use it, but only for certain purposes? I mean, it quite quickly becomes this, you know, morass of it's impossible these are not simple questions.
These aren't simple questions, and one of the many debates that we're having at the moment, and I think will get bigger, is the whole debate around identity, about what digital identity means, about who should hold your digital identity, about, I mean, there's a remarkable quote. She was from a few years ago. It was Eric Schmidt and Jared Cohen, who said that identity will be the most valuable commodity for citizens of the future, and identity will exist primarily online. And you think, well, yes, but where and who's going to?
Where, exactly. And currently it's Facebook.
Currently, well, Facebook would like it to be Facebook. Facebook would like, as he said, and we forget his letters, don't we? I mean, these long screeds that Mark Zuckerberg writes. But was it the 2017 one where he sort of said that he wants people to be able to go through Facebook to engage in their local community, to engage in politics, maybe even to vote.
Which means Facebook controls your connection to
Facebook
those.
becomes your identity, or at least I say your virtual identity, but of course that now, your virtual identity is so blurred with your real
And it's
world
sort of the broker between you and all these other things, your local community, your government, your
exactly.
schools.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's and when it comes to public services, the thing that really struck me, schools is a really good example, where this technological determinism and this belief that we should all be recording everything we do, and we should be using it to personalize services on our behalf, it brings with it an enormous amount of ideological baggage that actually they don't talk about at all. So a belief, you know, that actually measuring children and measuring and capturing data constantly about how their achievements and about what they're doing, etc., and then mapping that to an education pathway, and in many cases gamifying that pathway, that all these assumptions are really kind of substantial assumptions about the way in which we should structure our education systems.
Right.
And now, you know, I think Facebook has, 330 summit schools in the US, which it works with. Google's in Google Tools and Schools Tools, and now in 2/3 of US schools. You know, the next battle is in many ways for.
But in each of the assumptions that you're describing have not been challenged at any level. It's
Right.
just kind of been implemented.
Well, it's implemented off the back of an idea that the current system is broken, and this must be the way to fix it.
Right.
Technology must be the way to fix
But it's a kind of technological solutionism in a way. And it feels, in fact, you and I have talked about this before, it feels as though Mark Zuckerberg in particular, but Mark Zuckerberg also as a prototype or an archetype of this kind of Silicon Valley mentality, sees any problem, social, political, cultural, human, as fixable with programming.
the classic Maslow's law is, you know, if you have a hammer, any problem looks like
Right,
a nail. I mean,
right.
it is absolutely the way to deal with. I mean, the way to, so. And the difficulty is that actually that it's not restricted to the platforms. I mean, that technological determinism, one of the curious things about the last year or so that I've had is I've had many conversations with people outside the worlds that I normally work in, which is news and information journalism, but about subjects like disinformation and news. Suddenly it's become a very, very big topic, much more broadly. But many of the conversations, I mean, I'm often in rooms with people who are heads of cybersecurity, heads of cybercrime, people from sort of a kind of a home office or somewhere. And again, partly I suppose because they're looking for a solution, it's really attractive to talk about solving these things with AI. And as soon as I hear someone saying you can solve the problem of disinformation through
It's got to be a huge red flag. I mean, some of these problems are probably not even solvable. I mean, some of the things Facebook is struggling with, and I think not just Facebook, but us using technology are things that human beings have been doing since human beings were invented. I mean, these are not problems that just emerged. You know, they're...
And indeed, the disinformation problem, as we're learning, is not only is it not often about the so-called fake news, often it's about, you know, it's politically partisan, it's hyper-partisan. Propaganda. But equally, there's a remarkable report about the Indian election that actually a huge amount of the supposed disinformation online is orchestrated by the parties themselves and by campaigners involved closely with the parties. So, you know, when you get into a situation where, and in the case of the Philippines and Rodrigo Duterte, when he won his election in 2016, you know, he was helped enormously by a whole series of online influencers, very, very aggressive social media influencers, who were campaigning on his behalf and taking down his opponents. You know, so when you have...
And Germany saw the same thing, I think. There's these brigades of social media actors, and it's unclear, even while it's happening and even now after it's happened, who they are, why they did what they did. Was someone paying them, or are they just crazy fanatics? Or, you know, it's hard to trace sort of where they came from and what their motivation is, even to understand how it happens.
So this is where I think, because I think it's too easy to talk about a lot of this as being top down. You know, to blame a state, to blame Russia, to blame an individual. One of the things I think we really don't properly understand yet is the degree to which aspects of this are bottom up and aspects of this are. I mean, I was really struck when the recent New Zealand Christchurch attack.
Actually, I wanted to talk about that.
Because I don't know, I mean, many in this room are journalists, I'm sure they've seen, but I mean, obviously it's quite hard to get hold of the manifesto now, but...
it's not that hard, really.
Well, it's not
maybe not as hard as it should be.
But it is a remarkable document for anyone who wants to sort of understand aspects of this problem. Because, so Tarrant was clearly a member of 8chan. He posted his link to his live video at 8chan. He posted his manifesto to 8chan. The 8chan community very quickly started to adapt the video to avoid the AI from Facebook and YouTube. So it was harder to take down. But what particularly fascinated me about what Tarrant said, and a lot of it was kind of copy-pasted and stuff, but he said, where do you come to your... How did you come to your politics? Where did you find? How did you become ideologically engaged? He said, well, from the internet, of course. And then he said, so what would you say is your political journey? And he said, well, I started out as a communist, and then I became an anarchist, and then a libertarian, and then an eco-fascist. And when I was studying kind of 4chan, 8chan for the book, that's a pathway. That's a very familiar pathway, not just of the site itself, but of some of the communities within the site and how they developed. And so, I mean, you can see in a way how the certain online structures and certain online communities are normalizing extremism and radicalizing in a certain way, in a way that I think we fantastically underestimate. I think if we don't seek to understand, one of the really
How people get from one to the
how
other.
people get from one to the other, and how these communities work, and why they work in this way. And it's really easy to turn away from them because they're ugly. A lot of aspects of them are really ugly and unpleasant.
And
But
there's
actually,
also the issue of publicizing them as well, right? I mean,
Right.
Data and Society has written a lot about sort of amplification of, and so not publicizing the manifesto and not publicizing the views that are expressed in it, and yet how do you understand those things without looking at them?
Absolutely, and this is this awful catch-22 because one of the favorite games that the 4chan community and 8chan have been playing since 2007 is gaming the media, is trig the libs, is get a response out of the media, preferably an outraged, like, oh, look at this internet.
And much of the manifesto seems designed to do that too. I mean,
Exactly,
he's clearly
exactly.
trying to trigger specific responses.
Even to the point, I mean, it's almost written like a press release,
Yeah.
or a press conference, where he has a question from journalists and then answer from me.
Q&A, yeah.
Yeah, so
Like we're doing now. So we're going to have questions from you. I think there are going to be microphones. Yep, we've got microphones if you have a question. I, of course, have plenty, but I'm conscious of wanting to get to yours as well. Yes.
Right? Hi. I was wondering, you're always talking about content in some way, ads, political ads, news, whatever. And perhaps the scale thing you mentioned is the thing. We should perhaps tame them, and competition is the one thing we should regulate, instead of things of what they do and how they do it.
I certainly agree that I find it very strange when I'm in conversations and people are still asking the question, are these companies too big? I mean, how big do they have to get before they're too big? I mean, as you say, when there are, a third of humanity is an active user of Facebook. What do we want to get to? 50%? It sort of rewrites the rules of dominance. So I absolutely agree that it is the ultimate elephant in the room, that these companies are of such a scale that they have lost control effectively, and that's particularly apparent with digital advertising. And I won't go down the full rabbit hole of digital advertising, but one of the things that really I was astonished by when I was looking at the whole digital advertising market was the real-time ad exchanges. And the way in which, and apologies if many of you in the room know this already, but many people I know don't, when you go to a web page and many of the ads around the page are not filled in, it's not because the server's slow, it's because the moment you went to that page, your details, everything that is known about you was thrown onto an ad exchange, and then companies started bidding.
Header bidding, it's called, yeah.
And then the winning bid is the ad that gets served to gain your attention. So in that sense, they don't care what else is on that page.
Right.
They couldn't give a damn if it's a quality news story, if it's outraged opinion piece, if it's fake news. It doesn't matter. It's got your attention, and you are staring at it at that moment. So
And it is sort of hard to believe, even when I first started reading about it. So header bidding, which Google is a huge player in, obviously, it's in the nanoseconds as the page is loading, that all of those ads are being auctioned off to the highest bidder. So in fractions of a second, that entire page is being populated with ads based on what it knows about you, where you've been, where your browser's been, things you've clicked on.
Exactly, and so in that sense, that system to me is essentially anarchic. In that, of course, no single individual, no single company, no big number of individuals can police that or monitor that. I mean, it just happens. It's market. It's a market principle. And so no wonder you're going to be funding extremism. You're going to be funding fake news. You're going to be funding all these things. Of course you are. It's inevitable if you have a system as large and as out of control of that. I mean, I'm sure someone has done a more detailed analysis than me on this, but I was trying to work out if Facebook did institute some form of human moderation for content that's uploaded, what would that mean in terms of humans? How many people would that be? And I just thought, well, let's just look at photographs. Forget video and text posts and comments. Let's just look at photographs. And it's very difficult to find exact figures, but about 350 million photographs uploaded to Facebook a day. Let's say every photo is looked at for 10 seconds, and someone works constantly for an 8-hour day. You're talking about a minimum of 120,000 people all the time just
for photographs. Yeah.
So,
I mean, if you look at posts, video, comments, it's billions.
Right. So suddenly, that just doesn't work as a model. I mean, we might.
And yet they keep saying we're hiring more moderators, as though that's going to solve the problem.
And so if you, I mean, if you think the answer is we need to turn Facebook into a system where we have human moderators before that won't, Facebook will collapse before that happens. Now we could have a discussion around whether we think that's a good thing or a bad thing, but actually that current model just simply wouldn't work with human moderation.
So is there a need to break up Facebook, to break up Google? And if so, how do we do that?
Absolutely. I mean, we need to do two things. I think we need to absolutely find ways in which to break apart aspects of them. I mean, Google. So for me, in a way, there was a moment with Google, or maybe not a moment, sort of a couple of years in the early 2000s. When the shift really happened. And it was when it alighted, first of all, it alighted on its click ad model. But secondly, when it introduced AdSense. So anyone who's familiar, so Google's AdWords, the words that based on search criteria, so they're very much based around, there's a relevance, there's a link between what you're searching for and, right. But AdSense took it into a totally different area. AdSense, suddenly Google is just monetizing the web, and monetizing information on the web. And then it went even further when it bought DoubleClick. So it seems to me as though absolutely one can start to look at the different aspects of Google's dominance of Google of advertising on the web, and say, these things, I mean, funny enough,
And Facebook on the social side, you've got Facebook, the largest information, sort of social information entity ever, controls WhatsApp, which is also the largest text messaging, encrypted communication app, and Instagram, which is one of the largest image-based communication. I mean, should a single entity control all of those things?
When he did his latest piece,
Manifesto.
Mark Zuckerberg, I thought of it as that, that 3-cup trick where you
Hide
say, where's the ball?
Yeah.
It was almost like by talking about privacy and making it the centerpiece and stuff like that, he was almost saying, don't look what I'm doing over here, because I'm merging the back ends of WhatsApp and Instagram and Facebook.
Exactly.
Because yes, I agree. I mean, that's huge. I mean, if there wasn't ever an opportunity to break it up, it's disappearing pretty fast if he manages to completely integrate the whole back end.
Questions? Yeah, there's one back there.
My question has to do with accountability and anonymity. And I have an idea that many of the fake news things and all the terrible things done to influence politics and people's opinions are put online by anonymous and therefore not accountable entities, people, groups, clubs, and so forth and so on. Would there be any way to ban or to control or to moderate or to regulate or whatever the word is, anonymity online? That said, I'm a 17-year-old Thai boy and I get no advertising at all.
Anonymity.
So I think we come back slightly here to this question that I was talking about earlier about identity. Because I think in some ways you're entirely right. Funnily enough, actually, there's a great book by a woman called Jessica Baer who compares different online communities. And she tries to understand why there is such a different culture in a community like 4chan versus a community like World of Warcraft. When actually demographically many of the users are really similar, and she looks at the structures and how in World of Warcraft you have a kind of a pseudonym rather than a total anonymity. You carry that pseudonym for a long time. You gain a reputation over a period of time. You have to be part of a team. And
so it's sort of persistent pseudonymity instead of
exactly
actual
pseudonymity, and also you have to be liked because. And you compare that with 4chan, where it is properly anonymized, and where there really isn't any kind of a personal accountability in terms of reflecting back to the individual. So clearly, absolutely, identity is going to be a crucial part of the answer.
But it feels to me that getting rid of anonymity has some huge consequences. I mean, there are people who are anonymous for good reasons, people in countries where they can't speak freely, people who are, there are all sorts of reasons why, when I was dealing with comments at the newspaper that I worked for, there was this huge pressure to make people use their real names. Facebook has been pushing for real names, or what I call real sounding names. And yet, every time you do that, you leave certain people out, people who could have valuable things to contribute.
And you have potentially lots of other repercussions. So that's the reason why I talk.
Makes it easier to track people.
Exactly. The reason I talk about Aadhaar in the book is because there you have a system of identity. There you have a digital system of identity for a whole population. And quite quickly what was happening was that people were companies were making it provisional on having your Aadhaar number before they would speak to you and tracking you via your Aadhaar number. And then you had these whole companies, trust-based companies, about figuring out whether systems were trustworthy to give them loans on the basis of their Aadhaar identity.
And of course, China is doing that with social reputation.
Exactly. And so what you potentially get, if you're not careful, if you absolutely create a single online identity, is a centralization of power, particularly in the state, and the state's ability to track people and to control people.
There was another, yes. Do we have a mic? I think up here.
Hi, thanks. I totally agree with that the future is not unavoidable, it's not inevitable, and that the question of where do we want to be as human beings, or like in a few years' time, is not being discussed. My question is how to do it, how to start this public discussion. How would you do it?
Good question.
Great question. I think part of it starts here, actually. I mean, I think part of it is about, in some senses, Facebook's already taken over as the public sphere, for an awful lot of political discussion. But actually, the media is still an incredibly important public forum for discussing these issues. I mean, if there was ever a moment where, I come from a country where it'd be quite hard for anyone to say that politics wasn't broken, and the political system hadn't been shown to be wanting. So the evidence is sort of, I suppose, accumulating that the current systems are not adequate, the current systems are not functioning, the current systems aren't working. And actually
It's one thing to say that and to say this is what we need to replace it with.
Absolutely.
Right? How to describe
completely.
that.
Absolutely. But certainly the evidence, Yasha Mauk and others have looked at the evidence of beliefs in political systems around the world, and the evidence suggests that the confidence in democracy, particularly amongst young people, has been declining now for a number of years. And many people simply don't see democracy, or at least liberal democracy, as the answer. So we are in a very, I think, volatile and precarious world, and we have to, it seems to me, it's the obligation, particularly on people in this room, is to ask the questions about what systems do we need, what systems would be appropriate, how do we protect some of the things that we've spent the last 150, 200 years protecting, how do we protect them in a digital age? Because at the moment, the more that they get bypassed and abused, the less legitimate election and referendums are going to seem. And then people, I think, will more and more abandon the existing system.
I mean, that's a depressing statistic about feelings about democracy. I mean, and I'm conscious of, while we're discussing the systems that we should have, someone is building the systems that we will have.
Yes.
And it will be implemented and sort of set in stone by the time we come up with an answer.
Yeah.
In fact, even is now. Was there another question over here? Yeah. Oh, and 5? Okay. Short questions.
Okay, I'll try. Thank you so much for the debate so far. I wanted to ask about the, I suppose, the direction of causality, because it is really easy for liberal-thinking, Guardian-reading people to think, well, the problem is that the system has been hacked by technology companies, and that's why things are going wrong. But it may be that those companies are just taking advantage of hitherto opinions that weren't manifest. And that's something that's not very comfortable for people like me. I'm not thrilled that the UK is leaving the EU, but there are lots of people, including in my family, who agree with that. So maybe the direction of travel is the other way around, and actually they're just revealing things that were hitherto not revealed.
So the problem is coming from below as opposed to above.
Yeah.
There are aspects of that. I absolutely agree there are aspects of that. I think, however, I think it's quite hard to disassociate some of the structural elements of the platforms from the information that is surfaced and that is made prominent to us. There's that great phrase, what is it on YouTube, 3 degrees of Alex Jones. So you're never 3 degrees away from a conspiracy theory. But certainly from...
And YouTube clearly feeds that.
Exactly.
I mean, it's not that it created it, but it clearly feeds it.
Well, it feeds engagement, and it feeds an engagement in many instances is much more a product of emotional engagement, and it is much more a product of... So the thing that really struck me about the model of digital advertising and the way it works is that it is, and this is, I think, something people get confused about with, when we talk about persuasive political messaging, people think that it's about persuading people to change their minds. It's not. It's about mobilizing people. And that's a fundamental difference. And it's about behavioral responses. And that's exactly what, at root, digital advertising is all about. It's about making you click. It's about making you like. It's about making you share. It's about getting a reaction. And that's really what I think we've seen in politics, because political campaigns have realized that is what the new platforms are incredibly good at. They're incredibly good at provoking people to respond. And so it's less about changing your mind. It's less about convincing you of my opinion. It's more about just getting you, and it's not just necessarily going out on voting day. It's about getting you to share this with your friends. It's about getting you to essentially endorse a political view by liking it or even just reading it. So it's all about trying to gain a behavior response. And that, I think, does lead you down quite a... what is it Jonathan Haidt talks about? He talks about the elephant and the rider being the kind of the rational versus the less rational brain.
The thing that struck me about, in particular, the Russian troll activity on Facebook during the US election was that so much of it didn't seem designed to trigger a specific response or to get someone to vote in a specific way. It was just to create chaos. It was just to create sort of uncertainty and confusion, and then the assumption being you could take advantage of that later, but that it wasn't directed. It'd be easier in a way if it was directed at something specific, because then you could see that, as opposed to just let's create a lot of chaos and make people feel uncomfortable, and then we'll figure out how to handle that later.
So I think we could have another whole other round. The Russia question. The Russia question, I think, is just fascinating because, to me, and I mean, my background's all as a historian. I studied modern history, and that's where I come from. And so what immediately struck me about this, and what I sort of try and delve into in the book, is how a lot of what Russia is doing and its behavior is so consistent with its behavior for the last 100 years.
Yeah, it's just new tools.
It's new tools.
Yeah.
It's new tools. And some of the stuff, I mean, particularly if you look at Putin himself and his background and where he got his professional start in terms of the KGB. I mean, he grew up in the era of Andropov. And Andropov was paranoid about the world destabilizing Russia and thought that he absolutely saw the world as a zero-sum game. And the only way in which Russia could avoid being destabilized was by destabilizing
everybody else. Yeah.
And so, arms to the IRA, arms to the Red Brigade in Germany, try and overturn the Greek government in a coup, do whatever you could do to create as much havoc as you possibly could, because it could only ever benefit Russia in terms of stabilizing the Russian system.
Right, and then see what you could gain out of it after that.
Right.
Yeah.
Create chaos and then walk in at the end.
I think we are out of time, unfortunately. I wish we could take more questions. But please thank Martin for coming, and thank you all for taking part. That's great. Thank you. Wow, that was fast. Great, great.